Yes, thank you very much indeed, Clive, and thank you to the panel. I have a sense of foreboding, actually, during the whole of this period, that something is going to hit us in some way. I think there's no sense of complacency that everybody's got everything right. And in this final panel, we're going to be talking about what might be coming back to hit us, going to also be exploring a bit more the interlinkages between the fiscal and monetary policy, which we've not dealt with too much. But also, I do want to go back over the ground some of the historical issues that we still need to clear up. And all of my five panelists have made very great contributions, actually, to this story. I'm just going to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First of all, Ed Balls, who was latterly Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer between 2011 and 2015, because he was just inching his way gingerly onto the dance floor, so to speak, in the 1990s as Gordon Brown's chief advisor before the Labour government took power in 1997. And therefore, he's got quite a role to play there. We'll be telling us a little bit about that as well. Deanne Julius, who's a multifaceted lady from North America. She was put onto the Monetary Policy Committee as one of the external members in 1997, really to show the breadth of diversity that the British could summon up. You've done more or less everything, Deanne, in your life. You started off as an analyst for the CIA, for example, and you also chief economist at Royal Dutch Shell and British Airways. So looking forward to what you have to say. Bill Keegan, the doyen of financial journalists, who's been following all this, but also he worked for a while at the Bank of England. You've got one or two choice stories about that, Bill, and you can tell us a little bit about the pink coats and so on. Don Cohn, who's still a practicing central banker because he's on the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England and has been there for several years. You played a very important role in 2000 before you went onto the board of the governors of the Fed. You were secretary of the FOMC and you were head of the Monetary Policy Division, and you actually gave Britain some advice about the MPC and what kind of models we should be following. And you were vice chairman of the board during that period of time when you were on the board of the Federal Reserve. And then Paul Tucker, fascinating individual who's written a great book as well, Unelected Power, which is like a companion novel almost to Harold's. It's even longer than Harold's as well, and well worthwhile reading. But of course, you were the deputy governor in 2009 to 2013. You're at Harvard. You're the chair of the Systemic Risk Council, and very importantly, you were the principal private secretary to Robin Lee Pemberton in his final 4 years. So, Ed, to you, you've got a role, I think, in the past. I'd like to just ask you about that briefly. It did seem to come as a bit of a surprise, even to the Treasury, that the monetary policy operational competence of the Treasury was going to be transferred to the Bank of England in 1997. You'd had several conversations with Terry Burns. I know that in the period leading up to the election win, which was what generally expected. Can you just say a few words about the general level of surprise, both in the Treasury and also in the Bank of England? Why was it kept so secret beforehand, this march to independence in 1997?
I think it was a surprise, David, and that's partly because although we had prefigured reform of the Bank of England in the manifesto, we hadn't said we were going to move to full independence, and certainly as quickly as we set out. Partly because what was happening in the months before was there was an argument between the Chancellor, Ken Clarke, and Eddie George about interest rates, with Eddie advocating a higher interest rates. I don't think we wanted to be caught in a position pre-election of looking like we were arguing for higher interest rates at the time. And I think there was an assumption in the Treasury, certainly in parts of the Bank of England, we wouldn't move to independence until we made a decision about the euro. But obviously what we did was to have a reform of the Bank of England which was not compliant with the Maastricht Treaty. It became an alternative to joining the euro rather than a stepping stone towards it. I guess the thing I would like to say, having heard the earlier discussions, is that I don't think it's right to talk about there being an inevitability about what was happening in this period. I think Harold has written a really interesting, very full book. It's a book of contemporary history. I've been teaching a class at King's with Lord Nick Macpherson for the last 6 years on the Treasury and economic policy since 1945. And in contemporary history, you piece together different views from different players as you reach a full view through the fullness of time. And I think there'll be lots of people who would need to read Ken Clark's book or Norman Lamont's book, and maybe some of the contributions from people like Terry Burns and Alan Budd to get a full picture of what happened in 1992. But in that build up to 1997, first of all, as Harold says, there were problems in the Bank of England around financial supervision and things which had gone wrong. There was a personalisation in the relationship between the Chancellor and the Governor, which was destabilising. I think also the constitutional arrangements weren't in place in order to move to independence, unless you really quite substantially change the system. I think from my point of view, unless you had a system in our parliamentary world, it's different in the constitutional world, where if the government is accountable to Parliament for all of these decisions, the government has to set the objective inflation target. I think for it to be effective, it had to be clear and transparent and symmetric. And the target we inherited in 97 wasn't that. And I think also you needed those independent voices on the Monetary Policy Committee. So this wouldn't be seen, as Harold talks about in his book, as a kind of monarchy where the governor made the decision supported by individuals on the full-time Bank of England staff below him. It was only by moving to the committee and the 9 voices and the individual votes to deliver policy to meet a clear symmetric target set by the Chancellor. That was the reform which worked. That wasn't on the table before 1997. And I think without those wider accountabilities, I think independence wouldn't have happened, couldn't have happened. And let's be honest, neither Norman Lamont or Ken Clark were able to make it happen. So it wasn't inevitable. It required a big change.
Well, and it's very good because we'll just ask Deanne Julius in a moment as a member of that first Monetary Policy Committee about her role there. But just before we do that, and I'd like to ask you some other forward-looking questions a little bit later on. Harold says in his book that by the time of the financial crisis in 2007, the bank was a little bit like the famous hedgehog, the hedgehog and the fox. I think Isaiah Berlin, but several other people have written essays about this. It just concentrated on one thing. It was very good at one thing. It wasn't a fox that could do lots of things. It was a hedgehog who could just do one thing. Was that a danger always implicit in the system that you set up, that the bank would become very, very good at monetary policy, but not very good at financial stability, which it had also been asked to do? Or was that just a question of the personalities? As I said earlier to Mervyn, he just wasn't very interested in financial stability.
Well, I think Harold says this in the book, that once Mervyn became the governor, the bank focused less on financial stability issues. They weren't a personal focus of the governor. Mervyn told me that himself when he became the governor. There was more of an arm's length relationship with the Financial Services Authority. The system was designed from the beginning not to have one deputy governor, but to have 2 deputy governors, one for monetary policy and for financial stability. There were 3 times as many people working on financial stability in the Eddie George years as there were on monetary policy. All the information was there if the bank wanted it. Every meeting they wanted, they could have had. There was an argument at the time because there were senior figures in the bank who didn't think that should be the focus of the bank. They wanted it to be more on the monetary policy side. And I think that is the way in which things evolved over time. I was kind of surprised when Mervyn did his BBC Today programme lecture after he finished being governor, in which he seemed to suggest that it would have been better if the bank had kept responsibility for supervision back in 1997. But that was absolutely not the conversations we were having at the time. I think the problem was, as Peter Middleton said, whether inside or outside, supervision is complicated and you need a dialogue with the Treasury because these are the guys in charge of the overall budget, but also with the central bank because these are the people worrying about the system to make sure that individual risk is seen in a systemic context. And
I think that's a very good point, Ed.
The fact is, Peter, in that period, that wasn't seen. It wasn't seen partly because everybody missed it, but it also wasn't seen because the bank by that point wasn't looking hard enough to try and find those risks at the governor level.
Yes, I think there would have been some eyebrows raised at that point he made on the Today programme. By the way, I rather like the halo background that you've got with that rather nice orb in the background there. You look like the angel Gabriel, actually.
No symbolism.
Could I go on to now, Deanne? Deanne, you arrived at the Bank of England after this stellar international career. You were very much part of this idea of enshrining diversity. As Ed says, it wasn't supposed to be a decision just put with the governor. There was supposed to be a team of people, 4 from the bank, 4 from the Treasury, governor casting a vote. How did that system work, Deanne?
Well, I think there's no denying that the bank had a little teething problems with these 4 external diverse characters, 2 of us not British citizens even at the time.
Because you and Willem Biter, weren't you? They were the token foreigners there.
Well, yes, and indeed, all 4 of us had different personalities and different ways of looking at the data. Certainly, I remember when I first met Eddie in the bank after I'd actually taken up the role, coming from the corporate sector, I asked him, so who did I report to? I wanted to make sure I understood the rules of this new game. And he rather stuttered and stammered a little bit. And I said, well, do I report to you, Eddie? And he said, well, no, not exactly. I guess maybe it's the Treasury Select Committee. And I think that was extremely helpful to me, and certainly also meant that he understood exactly how this was meant to work, because it did mean that I could independently challenge others in the bank when the hierarchy didn't really work in our favor. And I have to say that the difficulty for the bank of fitting in the 4 of us was substantial. You know, we were not really meant to wander around and talk to the economics staff, for example. If I had a question on something that came up on one of the briefing papers, I tended to just pick up the phone and wanted to talk to that person. Well, it had to be set up as a meeting, usually in my office, so that I wasn't loose wandering around upstairs. And the division chief always came with the staff member.
And
so
you had to have a bit of a battle over your resources, didn't you?
Well, exactly. You know, if one of us wanted to have some additional research done on labor market or something that was in the forecast, it had to go through the prioritization process within the monetary analysis part of the bank. And so this was really unsatisfactory, and it hit the newspapers to some extent. It meant that we ended up having to go to court, which is the bank of the governors of the central bank, to get that resolved so that we could at least get some research done on things which we felt individually were important to our own view.
But I think you did have an ice-breaking role, and I would have thought that the external policy members these days are fully part of the bank's operating mechanisms.
I think that's true. I mean, it's a little hard to tell these days because there are so few votes against the majority, and you know, my colleagues there now have had didn't have the chances we did to raise interest rates, lower interest rates, do our own fine tuning of the forecast, all of these sorts of things, debate the minutes and to make sure that the minutes always reflected any minority view. There aren't many minority views now, so it's a little hard to tell just how much.
It was probably much more fun in those days, far more blood and guts, weren't there, in lots of ways. Let's go on to Bill Keegan, veteran from the Observer, but also with a spell at the Bank of England. Bill, what are your overall impressions of the book and the way it portrays all this intellectual skullduggery that went on over the years between the bank and the Treasury? And also several people, including Ian Prendergast and Norman Lamont, have both defended the bank against the idea that it was somehow stuffy and old-fashioned and anachronistic. They said it wasn't. What was your view, Bill, as somebody who's looked at this from many sides over the years? It's such a good question, but I can't see that Bill is there. So we're going to have to go on to the
Have you
next.
got me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Did you hear my question,
yes, I heard
Bill?
the question.
Good.
I struggle. I've always believed in technology as an economist, but I struggle with it. Anyway, yes, the several thoughts came there. Just before answer your question, one thing about I think one aspect that Ed and co had in mind when introducing the Monetary Policy Committee was to try and divert attention from the governor being the central figure. But as far as I could see, Mervyn continued to be the central figure in public, and so did Mark. The question is, will Andrew Bailey be? But so the governor was always very powerful. Anyway, stuffiness. It was very stuffy in 76-7 when I was there, and I think it was pretty stuffy later on. I think Gordon Richardson and Christopher Dow wanted to do something about that, and in particular, George Blunden, and I think that's brought out well in the book. But I'll give you an example of when I was at the bank, it seemed that 1/4 of the staff were actually watching the other 3/4. There was a huge personnel division. And when I had the good luck to meet my present wife, Hilary Stonefrost, who was then a bank official, I think Paul will remember this, and possibly Patricia, the most astonishing aspect of stuffiness came up at the bank. Somebody in that organization told Hilary that she had to stop seeing me if she was to be promoted to work for Charles Goodhart on monetary policy, because monetary policy was central and I was a critic of it. This showed such a ridiculous, it was about 5 levels. It was wrong. It showed lack of trust of her, lack of trust of me. It was bad anyway. And furthermore, I was talking to all sorts of people who were way above Hilary in the hierarchy. And finally, I didn't believe the monetary statistics anyway. But and this was in 1983. But I hope we've moved on since then. But it was an extraordinary example, I thought.
In terms of the intellectual badgering that still does go on today, even though there's quite a few Treasury people now as deputy governors, do you think we've always rather enjoyed this? I think it's all part of the Punch and Judy show of British politics to have a little bit of a gang warfare between the Bank of England and the Treasury. Does this still go on today, or is it more intellectual, more civilized these days?
I think plus ça change, actually. But I just must finish that Hilary thing. Of course, so she left the bank on principle, and she's had a very highly successful career at the bar. She might have become the first woman governor, but you never know. Anyway, I think I've heard these criticisms that there isn't enough Treasury, but this book is about the bank, and the Treasury does come up quite a lot. The only omission that I was surprised that Harold, in a really fantastic work, hardly mentioned the meeting at Bath before before Black Wednesday, which was a big event, but it comes up in passing. But that's a minor detail.
Well, we'll come back to Harold in a moment. I'm sure there's some things he left out. Maybe he got a bit bored with writing about Bath, possibly, Bill. That might be one of the reasons.
Yeah.
Don, thanks very much for joining us from the United States. As I alluded to earlier, you've had quite a big role in observing the Bank of England, both from afar and then when you were advising on the MPC in the 2000. And now, of course, if you were like a man from Mars, rather than a man from the United States, looking at the structure now, would you say that this is fit for purpose, or would you say, look, don't get too uppity, you British, because something's going to hit you and you're not going to be having the right structure? What are your thoughts there? How would you reform it if you had to, Don?
Thank you, David, and nice to be with you and to discuss this important book. So I think it is fit for purpose after the reforms following the global financial crisis. So going back to your discussion about separating supervision from the rest of the bank and having that financial stability function really decline in importance, and not have the tools. I mean, it could write very nice financial stability reports, but not really be able to do much about them when the supervision of the banks and the financial system was in another agency. So I think what the UK did after the crisis, moving bank supervision back into the Bank of England, creating the Financial Policy Committee where I sit, as I was doing this morning, and keeping the Monetary Policy Committee. I think that's a very nice set of committees and works very well, and actually works very well together. There's the overlapping membership. We have meetings together. We discuss common issues. So I do think the system that was set up that exists right now is quite a good one. That doesn't mean that something isn't going to happen that catches everybody by surprise. But I think from what we can see right now, I don't have any suggestions for changing the current structure. One thing to note is that it is unique, I think, in the world of having so much authority in one place. And a colleague of mine at Brookings, Nellie Lang, has done a survey of macroprudential policy all over the world. And the Bank of England is pretty much alone having all that authority. I think from that perspective, going back to your discussion with Deanne, the role of the externals is pretty important. So bringing outside perspectives and outside expertise, voicing our views, I think it really accentuates the importance of the externals and the importance of getting these issues that were certainly there in the late 90s and early 2000s, of giving them the resources, making sure they had the voice, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important point. And this internationality, which people like Andrew Crockett, I think, wanted all along, it certainly does has flourished. Now, Paul, all of this conversation, in a way, has been a build-up to what you're going to be saying, because, of course, all these issues about the right balance between leadership and transparency and accountability and efficiency is all summed up very well in your book. I think you also wanted to say a few words about inflation targeting, what Robin Lee Pemberton really did think about that. But in terms of the structure, can you also answer the question, why is it that the bank somehow, through this collection of rather diverse people in the 1990s, did actually produce a structure that was adequate for being made independent when Gordon Brown and Ed Balls decided that? You're on mute at the moment, Paul. You may need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, David. Congratulations, Harold. The book has the right title. It's definitely got the right picture on the front in Eddie George. And it was particularly interesting to hear people like David Scholey and Peter Middleton, who were actively involved, central figures in the 1980s. I wanted to say two things about the past and then use that as a bridge to answering your question. What the book does do has been very well discussed. What it doesn't do is bring out how a series of very complicated relationships between the key characters, who at the Bank of England's end, I would say, were George Blunden, who hasn't been mentioned enough, Eddie George and Mervyn and one or two others, nevertheless produced the results that you and others have described and Harold has kind of set out. And this wasn't easy. To give only one example, not only might Eddie not have become governor, he might well not have become deputy governor. Whitehall put up the most extraordinary battle to stop Eddie becoming deputy governor. And I know that because I conducted a good deal of that battle over the phone with my good and late lamented friend Jeremy Hayward as the governor's private secretary. And when Whitehall relented, I can remember, and I wish he were alive still for all, well, it's just terrible. We've lost him. Jeremy said to me, okay, but don't imagine that this is a route to the top job. And that's an enormous point, and I think a rather revealing point. The second thing to say is there was a kind of competition for credit earlier on between Mervyn a bit and Norman a bit and some others about the advent of inflation targeting. Whereas the truth is, things like this, successes don't happen without a lot of hands. So I absolutely am convinced that ideas like this were circulating in Treasury sometime before it happened, but they were also circulating in the bank. I mean, Robin Lee Pemberton, before Mervyn joined the bank, I was also the GPS when Robin raised with the top brass whether or not we ought to be going down the route of inflation targeting. So, but what's also true is that when we fell out of the RM, Mervyn and his team were ready, absolutely without doubt, ready. A draft of the first mock-up of the inflation report was ready. I can remember him bringing it round to the governor for discussion with the governor and Eddie, who by then was governor, and saying, so we talked about this is kind of what it might look like. And the key thing, this was a team that was prepared to fill a vacuum. And that's instructive, I think, because that's exactly what happened in after 2008 in the field of financial stability. So something else that I think is not in the book, but actually was incredibly important for how things turned out, was that in the early zeros, within the period, there was a G10 Financial Stability Forum study on whether or not it was possible to wind down a large and complex financial institution in an orderly way. A marvelous woman called Molly Wassam represented the Federal Reserve on this. And she and I and others who were on this group persuaded the co-chairs, one American, one Dutch, that this was not possible. And the report went up and absolutely nothing happened, which is a complete disgrace. And no historian's ever taken the interest in it, even though I keep on mentioning it.
They will now, Paul, surely.
Well, I've mentioned it on 4 other occasions. I think for anyone writing a history of this period, I don't mean not of the Bank of England, but of the international financial system, this is a key moment. What it meant was that some years later, when the opportunity arose, there were already reasonably crystallized thoughts about how what came to be called resolution policy had to be at the center of any framework for financial stability, that working back from the crisis was just as important as a framework that set out to anticipate and head off crisis. And here I want to mention something else, which was that Alistair Clark, I had to go for a comfort break, as they say, when Patricia was talking. And I think Patricia said a lot of things which are not only true, but importantly true. I don't know whether she mentioned Alistair Clark.
I don't think she did, no. As you said, he's not mentioned in the book.
Alistair isn't featured in the book. Well, I can tell you, while Patricia and John Trundle and others were getting on with the work, Alistair and I would sit in his office talking about whether or not the post-97 system was going to work. And our conclusion was, and I can remember Alistair saying this to me and me repeating it to him, it's going to look as though it works during peacetime, and it's not going to work in a crisis. And we actually were writing a paper which never got finished or published because I got promoted. And what I inherited, and the point of this story will become apparent in a second, what I inherited from Ian, as well as a kind of pile of work, was a private secretary called Matthew Hancock. And Matthew Hancock and I spent as many hours as Alistair and I did, really, thinking about, will this system work? And we reached the conclusion that actually something equivalent to the Monetary Policy Committee was needed on the financial stability side. And also, which I brought with me from Alistair, that you couldn't take the central bank out of this if it was the lender of last resort. Indeed, my own view in advance was that it would be a disaster for the central bank not to be involved in supervision at all if it was the lender of last resort. Now, here I want to say something about Mervyn. No one on earth has fought Mervyn as much as me on financial stability.
Yes.
Let us be absolutely clear about what Mervyn's position was, and that it was good. It was sound. And this also played a huge role in 2008, which was, it's all very well, and Don pointed towards this, it's all very well producing analytical papers and reports. And the financial stability report was important in the run-up to the crisis. And I don't think anyone's ever done a study of how much of what happened is prefigured in the financial stability report. And it's not everything, but it's not small. And I hope there are some people in the bank watching who are saying, yes, thank God someone has at last said that in public. But with no powers, you can do nothing. And without powers, you don't quite crystallize your thoughts as to what's really going on here that needs to be addressed.
Well, Paul, there's a tremendous amount of material in what you've just said. I want to move on, if I may.
All right, let me say one final thing about George Blunden, because I want to bring out the extent to which all of this came from the past. That the PRA was a subsidiary was an idea that George Blunden put to Gordon Richardson in the late 70s, that George Blunden put to Robin Lee Pemberton in the mid-1980s, and which I put to Robin Lee Pemberton and Eddie George in the early 1990s. These things all happen not because they're thought of in a rush, but because people have been spending time working on them for years and years.
Well, it really seems as though we've almost got the not the Harold James book here, because you've got a lot of material there that wasn't in the book. So you're giving a big impetus, I think, to future generations of authors. Just before I go on to Ed, because I know, Ed, you've got quite a lot to say about all this business, also having some kind of oversight council. I just wanted to quiz people about Eddie George for a moment, because as you say, it's right that he was put onto the cover. I mean, Bill, you might have a view on this. Not only did the Treasury rather resist him becoming the deputy governor, originally they didn't really want him to be the governor, did they? If you go back a few years, David Scoley was thought of as a candidate, as was Dennis Weatherstone. Why did the Treasury Bill in those days, back in before 1993, why did the Treasury, and John Major in particular, take against Eddie George?
I don't know, because oddly enough, Mrs. Thatcher, and I'm not her greatest fan, I think she was keen on Eddie George and wanted Eddie George.
Yes.
Well, somebody told me because he was too short or something like that, but rather silly idea. Ed, you could maybe comment on why the Treasury didn't like Eddie George as deputy governor, if that indeed was the case. But the much more important question is how you consider all these different bits of the arithmetic could be brought together. I know that you and Don and Paul rather disagree about whether in the UK we need a kind of FSOC, and also the idea that you've had, which is that the Financial Stability Committee and the Monetary Policy Committee need to be brought together. Could you just elaborate on some of those thoughts, please, Ed? You're on mute at the moment.
Thank you, David. Paul is right that by the time we got to 2006-07, we knew the system wasn't fully working properly. We needed further reform, and we actually, at my instigation, when I was Treasury Minister, instigated a 2-week war game where we gamed through dealing with the financial crisis in the end of 2006. Ironically, the case study the bank chose was a building society which got into trouble because of securitization and exposed the wider financial system. And it ended up with a 3-hour final meeting of the Stability Committee between myself and Mervyn and Callum McCarthy, where we worked out how we were going to deal with these issues. And a number of things came out of that. One was that it wasn't exactly clear where lender of last resort ended and the use of the government banks, the government's balance sheet started. There were problems around state aids. There were differences of view about moral hazard and the case for intervention. But of course, the fundamental thing it shows is that within that meeting in that war game, nobody, the bank, the Treasury, or the FSA, were ringing the alarm bell about what was happening in the real world, not in the war game around us at that time. That wasn't being run by the FSA, the supervisor. It wasn't being run by the Bank of England and its whole financial stability wing. It wasn't being run by the Treasury. People weren't seeing what was happening, and I'm afraid people weren't looking hard enough at what was going on. So Paul's right. We needed reform, and in my view, we needed to deepen the relationship which underpinned the Stability Committee. Personally, I've always been rather neutral as to whether supervision goes in the central bank or into another organization. The important thing is how information flows between the individual regulators, the systemic oversight in the central bank, and the Treasury, which is the in overall charge because of politics and the government balance sheet. In 97, the combination of BCCI, bearings, things which had gone wrong, plus our need to put regulation more widely onto a statutory footing, led us to a unified regulator. And frankly, at that time, and lots of people in the bank as well as in the Treasury agreed, that actually putting it all into one place, separate for the bank, rather than piling all of that other regulation into the bank from the non-statutory organisations at a time when we were going for independence, would have been overload. And that was the task we took. If you think about how things have evolved since, as I said, I'm neutral as to whether supervision is in the central bank or in the in another organization. And it's not clear ever quite whether the PRA is another organization or part of the Bank of England, but I guess it's part of the Bank of England. The issue is twofold. What is the nature of the information flows between different players in the system, the central bank governor, the Monetary Policy Committee, the head of the PRA, the head of the FCA, and the Treasury? And how does that information flow in normal times and in a crisis? And secondly, what is the nature of the accountability? And this is what, and I have worries on both fronts. With the Monetary Policy Committee, it's clear there is a symmetric target, which is easy to observe, which Parliament and the wider media understands, which is set by the Chancellor and then delivered by the MPC. When you move into the world of financial stability, things are much more opaque. The target is much less clear. There is less transparency in the operation of the FPC. It's much less understood externally. And it's worried me in the last 10 years that the Bank of England has ended up taking on much greater responsibility and de facto accountability, and not enough of that is devolved onto the Chancellor.
This is a point, Ed, that both Norman Lamont and Otmar Issing in different ways were making. I want to come back to you about if I may just ask you to pause there. There's several other people I know who'd like to talk. Don, you seem to be wanting to say something there. I know Harold wants to come in on that. And then I want to go back to Ed for the Financial Oversight Committee, but we're going to run out of time otherwise. So Don, a few words from you, please, on that.
Well, I do think that the current system, the PRA, first of all, the PRA does have external members. The PRC has external members. So it's not just a subsidiary of the Bank of England, or it is a subsidiary with outside information coming in. The second point I would make between the PRC or the PRA and the FPC is it's not just, information is critical. I totally agree with that, Ed. Without information, we couldn't make financial stability policy. But I think it's a deeper relationship than that. There's analysis, there's understanding, there's a shared goal. So having the deputy governor who's head of the PRA on the Financial Policy Committee is absolutely critical. And even from the start, I mean, Paul can talk to this as well, from the time of the interim Financial Policy Committee, the person who has been the head of the PRA has helped the FPC see what's possible, how to do it, how to accomplish, has helped us get to our objectives. So it's a very deep relationship there.
Yes, it's something. It's very difficult to legislate for that, isn't it? Harold, can I just bring you in there, because I know you've got several points out of all the things that were said up to now. Harold.
Thanks, David. Well, one of the points I wanted to make was exactly the point that Ed made very powerfully and very convincingly, that there's a kind of asymmetry between the financial stability story and the monetary stability story, and that financial stability, you don't see what the problem is until there is a problem, and then it's often too late, and it's very, very complex. So the issue about unwinding big, complex financial institutions, that's obviously something that people were thinking about for a long, long time in central banks, in the BIS, in the IMF. So, right back in the 1970s, when the buildup of the sovereign debt exposure of banks was setting in, the BIS constantly said we need more information, and there was always a pushback from the banks because they didn't want that to occur. And winding up a complex financial institution is obviously incredibly difficult. So if people think about the details of it, the mind just starts to go crazy. You take an example of Lehman, which is not a particularly big institution, but the bankruptcy proceedings for Lehman dragged on and on and on. And so, bits of Lehman were only completed in terms of bankruptcy last year. It's incredibly complex. And so I think you're almost in a perpetual world in which people in the central bank elsewhere are going to give warnings, and they're not going to be taken all that seriously because people are going to say, well, aren't things just fine? And so one of the responses to crisis, whether it's 2008 or whether it's today, is that you really have an opportunity for thinking what's not fine, because it's so urgent and so very, very obviously apparent.
Yes, that's a real lesson. I've got several questions now from the audience, which I want to try to rattle through. One might be for you, Deanne, and that is whether you can give a viewpoint now from your external vantage point about how well the bank is dealing with the COVID crisis, particularly the quantitative easing, which of course has multiplied now, is also gone into corporate bonds. Perhaps you could comment also on the indemnity, which several people believe in this link between fiscal policy and monetary policy does rather constrain the independence of the bank, the fact that there has to be this very close interconnection with the Treasury over the indemnity. Deanne, over to you.
Thank you, David. I think it's difficult for the bank to actually respond very effectively to the current crisis, it seems to me. Interest rates are at the zero bound. I personally think it would be a mistake if they go below zero, but it won't do much good anyway.
So do lots of people at the bank, it seems. Yeah.
And QE is not as symmetric, as transparent, as well understood as interest rate movements are. You know, all of the things that Ed and others have been saying are strengths of the Monetary Policy Committee when it deals with interest rates. I would hate to be out on these regional visits trying to explain to the business community how and why QE works and why 150 billion is better than 100. So I think that they have done a few things which probably were appropriate. Certainly taking interest rates down as far as they felt they could, I think was an appropriate move. But I think I would agree with a couple of the panelists in the previous session that additional QE is likely to have diminishing positive returns and certainly adds to the distortions in the system in terms of keeping.
Is it monetary financing? I mean, there's no reason why we can't admit it's monetary financing. Andrew Bailey doesn't seem to want to use that term, but Deanne and others, it's not illegal in this country to have monetary financing.
It's not illegal, but it's a risk. And I think that it's extremely important now that we are in this world of the Bank of England buying up large proportions of the government deficit. It's extremely important that the Bank of England be independent, be focused on inflation as a target, and that thereby improves the credibility of the government as it goes into deeper and deeper debt.
But Paul, would you like to comment on that, the Bank of England and its role now? And then another question is taking away the debt management side in 1997. Paul, you might like to comment on that. Was that the wise thing to do? It was seen as the quid pro quo, according to what we heard earlier. But Paul, those two questions, please.
I mean, Ian would have a view on this. At the time, I think Eddie was more bothered about the loss of debt management than he was bothered about the loss of supervision. In fact, that it turned out not to matter very much because the markets area was sufficiently involved in lots of different parts of the market so that when we had to do QE, which was debt management in reverse, that kind of wasn't an operational challenge. And in fact, unlike the Fed, and to the Bank of England's very great credit, the Bank of England didn't need to ask BlackRock or anyone like that to come and help it manage collateral because it could grow the expertise itself. And Mervyn, I must say, was tremendously supportive during that period, letting me effectively pick a very high quality team to do that. I think on what's going on now, just on the narrow point about QE, something that I think would help the public debate and perhaps help the bank would be if they were to say how much difference they think their recent incremental QE makes to the central outlook for economic activity in a couple of years' time and inflation to 2 to 3 years' time. And because there's this, if QE is thought of still as a regular part of macroeconomic stimulus, then it matters a lot that if, as Deanne says, its kind of marginal effects are declining, well, is the answer just do more and more and more?
It's interesting you say that because the ECB does come out with the calculations like that. Christine Lagarde brings those out at every press conference. So it's a good point you're making, Paul.
And the reason it matters is because, as the bank certainly knows, actions of this kind are observationally equivalent with taking steps just to kind of keep down government borrowing costs during a period of swelling public deficits. And that doesn't mean that that's the motive, but it does, I think, underline the importance of being able to explain what they're doing credibly in terms of their mandate. I think it was a great mistake to change. It's a small thing in a way, but a great mistake to change of the name of the inflation report from the inflation report to the monetary policy report, because then it becomes, what would we like to use monetary policy to do now? Well, there are all sorts of things. If you're given give someone like me, and therefore the people in the Bank of England, a credit portfolio, you can use it to pursue all sorts of social goals. And
yes.
The question is, how on earth do we know whether they're doing it well or badly, and who should be deciding?
Bill, I can see a column coming on that. But could I just ask Ian if you could comment on a 30-second comment, Ian, thanks for being with us from South Africa, on the question about taking away the debt management. That was actually quite a big issue, wasn't it, in 1997?
I'd very much like to set the record straight there. I too was in the bank on that Monday morning with Mervyn and Eddie. And in the session I had with Eddie, we read through the letter, the draft letter, and he said to me, they're going to take away debt management. Does that matter? And I said to him, well, I think it's stupid. But if that's the price of monetary independence, then absolutely we'll go along with that. The debt management was a minor part of it. Monetary independence was huge.
Yes. Bill Keegan, I think you make the point in your book too about that, the prudence of Gordon Brown. Ian, sorry, you slowed down a bit on that, but we got your words. Bill, would you like to comment on that? Well, how big a seminal change was that?
Well, it was, but it's interesting. It's the first time, I've known Ian for years, it's the first time I've heard that. We're always learning more.
Yes.
But I'd like to go back to Eddie. I'd echo, Eddie was fascinating on, well, it's brought up in the book that the bank was agonizing about entry to the ERM, day by day, and it's beautifully brought out. And I was amused, and it was obvious that Eddie was rather doubtful about all this. And within days of our being in the ERM, Eddie was muttering, well, we could change interest rates if we weren't in the ERM. And that's brought out nicely. And one other thing I'd like to point out that, as you know, in our book, we covered the story that the Observer did spot that we were shadowing the ERM after the Louvre agreement.
Yes, you had lunch with somebody, didn't you, as you habitually do?
But we had, it was denied by Bernard Ingham, who was working for Mrs. Thatcher. And about 6 months ago, before COVID, my brother Victor and I were invited to lunch by Bernard Ingham in Croydon. He's in his 90s, and he's obsessed by the relationship even now between Lawson and Thatcher. And he said, are you sure it started then? Wasn't he shadowing it even before the Louvre agreement? I said, as far as I know, he wasn't.
Yes, Mrs. Thatcher was not amused. We've just got a few minutes left. Ed, I want you to carry on from what you were talking about before, about the Bank of England possibly doing too much and being somewhat overexposed. And if I understand it rightly, the idea that you and Gordon Brown have taken up now about this oversight committee, is it an attempt to put the Treasury back into the driving seat, or is it an attempt to protect the Bank of England from being overexposed, or possibly both?
I'm not arguing the bank is doing too much, but I do think that the reforms have left the bank too politically overexposed. I think that is partly about accountability. It is partly about information flows. I'm sure Don is right about the information flows which happen between the PRA and the FPC. And there's a question about coordination between the FPC and the monetary policy makers. But at the moment, what you don't have, as you had in the old under the old system, regular flows of information from the heads of the PRA, from the FPC, directly to the Chancellor. It's all mediated through one individual, the Governor of the Bank of England. And I think that is a reason for concern. But then things also go the other way. If you have something complicated like financial stability, it needs to be clear that this is something where the Treasury, the Chancellor, is tasking the Bank of England, and it absorbs the political risk of individual decisions from the Bank of England rather than leaving it to its own devices, which is where I think we are at the moment. That's why I've advocated, because you can't have a simple inflation target. What we need is some kind of standing committee, a bit like the US FSOC, chaired by the Chancellor, with the governor and the deputy governors, which doesn't need to meet often in normal times. Once a year is fine, which sets the detailed remit for the FPC alongside the monetary target, the inflation target, makes it clear this is owned by the government. In the end, the buck stops with the Chancellor, but also means that in more difficult times, you've already established the place where the information flows and where the committee meets to deal with a crisis, chaired by the Chancellor, because that's how things have to work in practice.
We'll ask Don in a moment. Where physically would that meet? Would that meet at the Treasury, or would it meet in, say, the law courts halfway between? When we get back to physical meetings, where would you have the meeting place for this?
We don't have a constitution where the Bank of England has a kind of separate standing. Its power flows from Parliament, and the Chancellor in Parliament and the Cabinet are the people who hold that accountability. So of course, the Bank of England, the senior guys, would come to the Treasury for the meeting. I mean, in normal times, the Chancellor also goes to have lunch with the Governor, and that's fine. But formally, the inflation target is set by the Chancellor. The MPC has given a remit to deliver that inflation target for the government, reporting to Parliament. On financial stability, we need the same thing. It needs to be clear that the remit is being set by the Treasury, by the Chancellor, and the Bank of England is the agent to deliver that and to make it operationally independently the individual decisions. If not, we will end up, given the opaqueness of this world, suddenly where there is a crisis, the Chancellor can say, well, you know, what were they up to?
Not me, Gov.
Needle sheep. And at that moment, suddenly, that's a bigger crisis in the life of the Bank of England.
Look, thank you for putting that so explicitly. You've talked about this before, I know, in your Harvard paper, but I think you've given a little bit of an extra pirouette here to put that onto the floor. Don and Paul, quick comments from you, but we're going to have to wrap up in a moment. I want to get Deanne and Bill to give last words. Don?
So I guess I don't see the need for Ed's oversight committee. The Chancellor, I remind Ed that there is a Treasury representative sitting in the committee meetings, in the FPC meetings all the time. So the Chancellor is not dependent on the governor to convey what happened in those meetings. And there is a remit letter from the Chancellor every year. This year, I looked it up last night, anticipating this. It's 12 pages long. Now, half of those pages are boilerplate, but half of them are specific subjects that he wants us to concentrate on.
We're heading out of time in a moment. Paul, a quick 20-second rejoinder.
That remit is too long. The FPC could have lent against some of the asset price boom. I wish external members, well, actually, I just wish there were votes in FPC, because I think that would enhance the debate in front of the Select Committee. I mean, with Hancock, I am the main architect of this. The bit that hasn't worked out at all, as I would have thought, is the debate, the accountability to the TSC doesn't work. What happens at the Monetary Policy Committee is that because there are minority votes, that actually focuses the public debate and those public hearings. And it had never occurred to me how important that was before. And, you know, hands up. And I hope Andrew will actually kind of just make the FPC a bigger part of our public life.
Good. Well, thank you. A very good recommendation. Deanne, what do you think about all that? When a former Treasury Minister says, I want to help, you as an ex-Bank of Englander, you might feel a bit suspicious, but what do you say to that?
I think we have enough committees and enough oversight in the structure that we've got already. So I agree with Don on that. I don't see a problem in communication. I also do think, just to second the point that was just made, I think that votes, recorded votes, individually recorded votes are absolutely critical in making sure that you do get independent views, that you know you can't just go before the committee, the Treasury Committee, and say, well, gee, I just went along with the majority because I knew it wouldn't matter. You actually have to defend why you voted the way you did. And I think that was an extremely important innovation in the way.
Thank you. Bill, one last word from you, and then perhaps you'll have a quick word from Harold, and then go over to John Orchard for the final denouement. Bill?
Thank you, David. For a start, I was very struck by the earlier of all the conversations, and seems to me a suitable degree of humility around about how you handle all these things. But David Scoley made an interesting point, which was controversial to some, about doing good by stealth. Well, I'd like to say that doing good by stealth has its advantages. And in the early 80s, the bank was very important stealthily, I think under David Walker, in keeping going sections of British industry that were being neglected because of the very high exchange rate and those monetarist policies.
Well, there we are. The wheel may turn full circle. Harold, you must be gathering material for a second edition as we speak. Quick word from you, and then I'll pass over to John Orchard.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure whether it's a second edition or a sequel, but I thought in terms of this discussion of where the discussion between the central bank and the finance ministry, or the Bank of England and the Treasury, should take place. One of the most crucial things, and it's I think really borne out by the story of the financial crisis, is the consequences of spillovers from one country to another. And so it seems to me, if you're thinking about where that kind of liaison should take place, it should take place, of course, in the UK, but it also should take place in Basel or in Washington, in the BIS and the IMF. And the story of how the rest of the world impacts what you do and how you impact what the rest of the world do is surely a topic that can't just be left to internal domestic discussions.
Good. Well, we've done our best to internationalize this, but no doubt we could do even better. One thought I had right at the very end is that lots of people were claiming credit for the IT, the inflation targeting. There's a German phrase, of course, which says that success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. And I guess we've summed that one up very well. I'd like to before passing over to John, I'd like to thank everybody, not just this panel, but all the panels have been incredibly innovating, I would say. So Don, Ed, Bill, Deanne, Paul, Harold, thank you very much for being there as an ever-present there. Harold, the man tied to the steering wheel, I would say, throughout the whole of these 3 hours. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Over to John Orchard.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, everyone. I'll be very brief. 3 hours is a long time to spend on Zoom by anyone's standards, but I think they've flown by. I particularly enjoyed learning what was going on behind the scenes between the bank's independence and the great financial crisis. I think we heard breaking news, historical version from Ed Balls and Paul Tucker. So thank you very much for that. They've been wonderful discussions. The question often comes up in our discussions at the moment about how far central bank remits should go, and they have done today, given the proliferation of new objectives or modifications of existing ones. And that contrasts, I think, with the narrow mandate we were talking that the Bank of England had, wisely or not, immediately after independence, or the Bundesbank, for example. And it's been fascinating to hear today where bank supervision and financial stability management should sit, for example. I somewhat concluded from the session today that there is, never will be, a perfect way to organize a central bank. All systems seem to generate their own entropy. I think we've learned that today. But I can promise you that ONFIF will continue to follow the merry-go-round very carefully. So do keep checking in with our sessions, reading our coverage on this, and we indeed will be writing up some of what we've heard today. So thank you, panelists, for the excellent discussion. Thank you to Harold for launching his book with us. But most of all, thank you all to listeners today. So have a very good evening. We're delighted you could join us today. Have a good evening. Goodbye.